Welcome to the STR Data Lab.
Hello and welcome to the STR Data Lab. I'm Jamie Lane, Chief Economist at AirDNA, and I'm joined today by a repeat guest, Catherine Ratcliffe. Catherine, welcome to the show. We've had a lot happen. Last time we talked, it was about insurance, HR, and now we're going to maybe talk about something entirely different, another sort of expertise you have, and it's around Canada and Canadian short-term rentals, because there's just been so much news lately with the new Trump administration coming in, proposed tariffs, proposed and all sorts of stuff. And we've been talking about doing this for a couple weeks, and it felt like now we got to do it. We got to talk, and we got to figure out what all this means for really just the industry. As a Canadian operators that are listening, or for anyone in the US or maybe even globally, like this could have massive implications for travel movements and for our sector in general, because there's just so much going on in Canada right now.
100%. And thank you so much for having me back on the show. It's exciting always to sit down and talk to you about whatever the topic is. But I love that we were able to. I'm glad we scheduled this when we did. I didn't exactly foresee all the topics that we would end up covering, but it's interesting because as two of the largest countries in North America here, right? There's a lot of conversations about the relationship between the two countries. And I think there's a lot of travel that happens back and forth. I looked at some of my metrics in terms of the number of guests that I have, and my market's different than I think a lot of other people where they see a lot of Canadian travel. And so there's, this week especially, I think it's a tough week. It's a tough period, I think, in a long-standing relationship. I can't think of, certainly in my lifetime, a time where you would go to a sporting event and have anthems booed on one side or the other. Like it's a low point, I think, in the relationship, and regardless as to where it started and how it fell, like there's some fallout that's coming, and we've seen on both sides some political voices have opinions about what the relationship should look like, whether there is no more relationship or we're going to swallow you up, like whichever side of that you're listening to. At the end of the day, there's a real impact of what's coming from do people want to travel into the United States? Do people want to travel into Canada? When you have the leader of a country recommending that you not travel to the United States, when you've got the premiers of provinces saying we recommend that you not travel into the United States, like that will likely have an impact. But the currency exchange will also lead to a challenge. So the dollar fell to I wouldn't say historic lows, but it's been the lowest it's been in decades. And that has an impact even for those guests who want to travel, because from a budgetary perspective, now how I've priced my listing effectively shuts in international travel out of their ability to rent my property.
Yeah, and just to give some sort of context around like what sort of numbers we're talking about, because people might be thinking about their listings and like, oh, I've never really seen a Canadian traveler stay at my unit. But like just in terms of like total travel volumes, over the past year, we saw over 20 million Canadians visit the US, which is a massive amount for one country in terms of visitors coming to the US. That's essentially 30% of total overseas or international visitations to the US. So, and nearly one third of all international travelers coming to the US are from Canada. So, a total of 71 million over the past year, international visitors came. And when we look at short term rentals and specifically, we see overall international travel accounts for about 11% of total short-term rental trips. And of that, of all trips, all stays happening in US short-term rentals, Canadians represent 3% of total demand. So we think about total demand in the US, like over 200 million nights sold last year, 3% of that, that's 6 million nights. Like that's a lot of nights coming from Canadians. And the strong dollar, and as we've talked about, like that makes it significantly more expensive for Canadians to come. And if all of a sudden the euro's cheaper or other currencies are cheaper, or maybe and Canadians just decide to travel and domestically, like that can have a big impact on US travel trends.
Absolutely. And I think it's also interesting, I think, because there's this sense of patriotism that it's somewhat, an obligation now to stay within Canada. And so when you think about, like, as you divide up that travel, how much of that is travel sports teams, how much of that is family leisure that instead of Florida would choose Mexico, would choose Cuba, would choose other markets that could deliver a similar experience but at a more affordable cost and not feel like you've betrayed, your country in some way. And I think the flip of that is true too. Americans now looking at destinations within Canada, it is cheaper. But are we welcome there? What's the experience of an American family traveling into, Canmore in Alberta or traveling into Toronto? Are we going to be, you know, welcomed? Is that going to be a positive experience that we would want to spend our hard-earned vacation dollars there as well? And then, of course, within what we were originally going to talk about was the Montreal ban on short-term rentals together. There's a lower demand of availability. We saw BC expand regulations, even from a year ago with what they were doing in terms of the 90 days with the larger cities, and they've expanded that despite a leadership change provincially. And now you've got Montreal saying, we understand this problem was an issue with an illegal short-term rental, but we can't even police the legal rentals, so we're just going to ban all rentals. So it was really interesting, to sit there and dissect word by word what was coming out of, Trudeau's press conference that he held on Saturday about talking about going to national parks and lakes because short-term rentals aren't really on the map. That's not sort of an agenda. But as we talked about last year with, the short-term rental market in Canada is very different than the United States. It's an access to healthcare avenue. And so if all of Montreal has some centers of excellence in terms of hospitals, and if there is no ability to rent a short-term rental, what does that do for somebody who needs to come in from Northern Quebec, that needs, chemotherapy treatment or stem cell transplant? What do all those things mean? And I think it's a very complicated time. I think on both sides, people are sort of taking this minute by minute. Of course, there's so much that's happening here in the US. It's hard for a lot of Americans to conceptualize what's actually happening in Canada.
Yeah. So, and I've got a lot of questions about a lot of those topics, but maybe just start with what is your connection to Canada and how did you become such an expert on Canadian, whether politics and short term rentals?
Well, I grew up there. I was born and raised in Ottawa, which is the capital of the country, and it's the hub of political life in Canada. And so all of your I can't speak to what life is like in DC. Ottawa is very small. It's walkable, and there's certainly not the protections that you have. You don't have the sense of security. So you're in school with prime minister's kids, and so it becomes a very real thing. Who's in government, who's not in government. It's not as predictable as it is here in the United States, where we have an election every 4 years. They can call snap elections. Ontario is going through that now. Doug Ford put all of his chips in and called an election. I don't know if he's going to win that. For the short-term rental industry, that is a question because he has been supportive of the short-term rental industry in Ontario. And so all that to say, we were kind of always tuned in when you're, I think, in that environment. I I'm from an Anglophone household. And so topics that for most people outside of that, you know, Ottawa, Quebec borderline area, maybe they don't matter as much if you're out west. What's going on from a language lot, they still matter, FYI. But it was very like you felt it, right? And everybody comes to the Capitol to protest. And so whether they were protesting Revenue Canada or they were protesting language laws or whatever they were protesting, they were coming there. It was impossible to not feel the political temperature of the day. And so I left at a relatively young age. I moved to the United States, but I still stayed very involved because for work I was always working at in some capacity, import export into Canada from an insurance perspective. There was a lot of things that I was always constantly touching Canada. Of course, my family's still there. My brother is a federal politician up there, and so it's impossible not to know, some of the things that go on in just because, you end up on the periphery of that. And there's nothing, I think, stranger than being on the periphery of somebody else's political career. I never thought I mattered much. And so they're, looking for something to say. But so it was a frustration for me because Americans, and I'm married to one, happily married to one, they just fundamentally don't understand anything about Canada. And it's just sort of like it's there. They're not that different from us. They speak the same language. And when I moved here, I thought all those same things as a Canadian moving to the United States. And I got a crash course in how different everything was. Everything from, the way I spelt words to banking regulations to literally everything was different. And it was very disorienting. It probably would have been easier for me to move to a country that had a totally different language. But it was complex. And so in the short-term rental industry, for insurance, I mean, you're talking about highly regulated things, import, export, lots of regulation. Short-term rental doesn't have as much regulation. And it's one of those things that, we fear, but we also kind of embrace. But when it comes to this international, whether you're a short-term rental operator in Canada or you're one in the US, the confines, we fit in this weird gray area where we're not a hotel. And so we don't fall under their regulations, but we're not also exclusively residential. So we don't fit under those regulations. So we get this mix of, regulations come, they go. They're not necessarily specific. People interpret this way versus that way. And it's different. And so what I found really peculiar was this lack of understanding of the market. My mother was in healthcare at a center of excellence in Ottawa, and it was very common for children to have to come in 12, 18 hours from Northern Ontario to come to a children's hospital. And that concept is lost on Americans. So the way you market, the regulations you have to operate under successfully, if you want to be able to, maintain a successful operation, it was just different. And so I dialed into this and felt like I needed to stand up for my Canadian roots and say, like, we're not. And it was, I think I said this a year ago when I was on several podcasts. We are not the 51st state. And whether philosophically believe that there should be an economic, absorption or not, I think you have to understand that even within the provincial and territory platform of Canada, it's so different from province to province. And there needs to be a level of understanding and I think respect of what goes on there, because there's a lot of dealings that take place. There are tariffs have been a big conversation the last couple of weeks, but there are tariffs that take place interprovincially. And that may be a thing in the United States as well. I don't know that anybody's ever been arrested in the United States for buying beer in one state to bring to another state, but that happened in Canada. And so, like, the nuances are very, very important to understand before you just say, we're bigger and louder, and therefore you should be part of us.
So maybe let's talk through some of the things that have happened recently in the impacts, because we've got a Canadian Prime Minister who famously tweeted about and short-term rentals in Canada, uh,
Yeah.
and very recently, and sort of questioning whether they should even be allowed, given the housing crisis that's sort of ongoing in Canada. And now we've got a hotelier in the Oval Office in the US who has famously run a travel company, knows the hotel industry, knows the travel and tourism industry, and where maybe some of the potential regulations or tariffs and sort of posturing isn't directly targeted towards travel and tourism. Travel and tourism could be maybe the sectors that's impacted the most because of sort of perception and just changes in how people travel. Because and everyone has a choice on where they go, if it's leisure travel. And then we've also had and massive changes in regulation in Canada recently. So maybe let's talk about some of those and some of the proposed ones and then some of the enacted ones because we've got a variety and maybe start with Montreal because I know I wasn't expecting to see this. It really caught me off guard, and I don't look at Canadian politics and regulation every day, but sort of keep up to date. And this wasn't on my 2025 Canada bingo card to have short-term rentals essentially banned in Montreal relatively quickly. So if you could just explain like what was proposed and why you think maybe it came to be, if you have an opinion.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing you need to understand is, like, Quebec is like its own country, right? I mean, they there is nothing that you can say, "Well, this happened in BC, and so that's why Montreal did this," right? Like, Quebec is its own entity, and it's they have a unique way of approaching everything. And sometimes that's really endearing and really charming, and there's some beautiful aspects of the French Canadian culture. And other times it is this across the board, it's over, right? And I think people in 2019 going back to politics for like they saw that when you had, the religious ban come in where no public sector worker could have any symbol of any kind of religious work, and you had like 1 year to find another job or get out of the province, right? So they've come in with sweeping legislation previously. It did not surprise me, right? And so when you're talking about, are we going to take government resources? We've identified there was a problem. And this is the challenge, I think. When you identify a problem, how you message the problem and how we should react to it doesn't always get you what you want, which is what I think we're seeing right now between the two countries. So a lot of the media even around the fire in Montreal that took place, which was an illegal short-term rental, and it was is very unfair that that is posted up as a poster child of short-term rentals in Quebec, because I don't think that's fair to the operators who adhere to safety standards, who take great pride in what they do. But a lot of the opposing narratives that went through and explained what had happened, and even some of the rumors about this was arson and this was for insurance and all of that stuff, it doesn't necessarily go across on social media because there is a government content regulation that bans news articles from being posted on Facebook and social media platforms. So it's very hard to communicate with the general public about what's going on unless you have a very direct platform. And Facebook is not a direct platform. So the government is trying to make decisions about where do we invest resources, like all governments at this point, right? Everybody's got a deficit. I don't think there's one government necessarily that I can think of off the top of my head that isn't running some form of deficit, however big or small. And so they turn around and they say, we can't administer this. So we're just not going to allow it. It's not important to us. And I think you go back to the conversation. You've got a federal government that's against short-term rentals. You have a massive hotel lobby. They have one there. We have one here. And the short-term rental industry is fragmented. There is not a massive lobby that everybody is behind, that everybody says, this is who we are, this is our position, and we're going to partner to advance this agenda. It's fragmented of I'm a host, I'm an investor, I'm a property manager, I'm a big professional property manager. And so we've sort of cannibalized our ability to negotiate on the same level that a big hotel conglomerate can or lobbying firm can. The other thing that's different in Canada is the way that PACs work, right? So in the US, it's very easy to have a PAC. You have big corporate sponsorships and you can get candidates elected. In Canada, they don't allow that. So it's individual donations. They're capped at a very low dollar amount, $1,700 Canadian per tax year. So it's a big deal to try to go out and get those supporters. It's a big deal to get that elected official to support your agenda, and we don't have a cohesive message. So, of all the issues they're concerned about, what they're hearing is housing, healthcare, education. For sure, we're not on that list as to solving any of those problems because we don't have a cohesive message.
Yeah. So, have you seen or heard of anyone doing a regulation like this though? This one just surprised me around like, all right, we can't regulate it. We think that we still like want to allow these tourists to come in during the summer. So we're just going to ban it outside of the summer months. So if we know of anything that's operating, we know it's illegal because everything will be illegal outside of this sort of 90-day period. And then when you look at like Canadian short-term rental performance, like even outside of the summer, like 66% of nights sold are outside of the summer months. 74% of the revenue is outside of the summer months. So like, and if someone can't operate more than the summer, like is short-term rentals even going to be viable in Montreal after this ban?
I I don't know that it's viable. I think there's gonna be a lot of nuances that go along with this. I'll say this, there's nothing that is black and white about Quebec, right? There is no any regulation that they have, it is very, very nuanced. And they have their own economic, um principles that they operate under. And sometimes when you have government regulation, it is not necessarily to eliminate something, it's to collect the fee for an illegal operation. So, it's almost like some double speak that can kinda go on, and I think depending on what your setup is, it's cheaper to pay the fine. For I liken it because, the thing that impacted my life the most was when healthcare reform came in the US, right? I remember exactly where I was. I remember standing in a Total Wine store and just filling my shopping cart thinking my career was over, this was it. Because they were gonna mandate and there was gonna be penalties and it, was gonna be cheaper for employers to pay the penalty than to offer health insurance. And the reality was it flipped the other way. But there's a formula for everything. So, depending on what your operating rate is, depending on those metrics you just described, and again, there's a big difference between a one-bedroom studio versus a ski chalet, right? What does the penalty look like? Yes, they might know that it's illegal. And yes, they might be willing to accept the fine. How long can they operate on illegal activity? Again, you have these interesting political cycles that are happening at the same time. That how long does that say? I think everybody thought in BC when the government changed, the regulation was going to change, and it didn't. It actually expanded. So, we're facing a situation so Trudeau's stepped down, but he's still, the, interim PM, and there's a federal leadership race. And it's been a very, or I shouldn't say federal, it's a liberal leadership race, for the federal leader, and it's been a very interesting one that, you had somebody get kicked out despite having the mandatory $350, deposit and all the signatures required because he didn't speak French, and because he said that he didn't think language was an issue in politics. Now, there's a lot of backroom stories about what else went on, but that I think was the, aired talking points that went on the news cycle. You've got somebody who is not even a Canadian resident at this point, who hasn't picked a seat to run for that is you know, expected to be the leader. And he's got a banking background from, Bank of Canada, Bank of England. He holds, 3 passports. And so the question is like, what happens? What does he say if he comes in on if he wins, if they enact the emergency powers and punt the election to 2026 instead of 2025, what does he say? Historically, the federal government will never go against Quebec. If you lose Quebec, you lose the election. So Montreal is one city within Quebec. And so there's that to take into consideration as well. Does this push things out into other areas? Does Ontario pick up? Because Montreal is 2 hours from Ontario. Does that move other types of events outside of Montreal? And then, so I think it really comes down to some of the very specific nuances that, end up being enforced, because you can also have laws that aren't enforced.
Yeah. And speaking of that, like of what's maybe we can transition a bit to what's going on in British Columbia. Because we were out in Banff in April of last year for your Can States conference. I'd say with the people I talked to were pretty worried, and is to maybe put a understate like what the reaction was around the changing laws in British Columbia around short-term rentals. And now looking in the sort of months afterwards, in some of the areas that saw pretty restrictive laws go into place, yes, we've seen a decrease, but it's only been a 14% decrease in active listings. And across British Columbia in general, we've seen, overall about a 10% decline in listings, about a 10% decline in demand. So, yes, there's been a pullback, but it hasn't been like maybe a complete and destruction of and short-term rental inventory, like I think some were worried about. So what do you see that's actually played out in British Columbia?
Well, I think the biggest thing is the investors that have just said, like, I'm not going to sit this out and I'm not going to worry about what this looks like. Right. And so I think that's the biggest shift. But I think you're right. There's a lot that we thought was coming that didn't come. And I think there was a lot of hard work done on a lot of people's parts to say, "Hey, what about?" And I think when you make a really complex law, you have to always think about how are you actually going to enforce that? And who's going to be your partner in enforcing that, right? So in this scenario, you have to depend on Airbnb or any of the other OTAs, Verbo, Booking. They have to be your partner in this legislation to be able to say, we're not going to allow your listing to go up without this number. And so I think there's been a lot of negotiating that's been going on behind the scenes as well to say, like, because there was a lot of conversation about, was it impacted if it was a reservation that was already on the books? Did you have to go and cancel reservations? And there was an interpretation that said, no, you didn't have to do that. You just couldn't take any new listings or any new bookings. And then there was an interpretation that said, well, you couldn't book on an OTA, but you could book on a direct website. And so that's where when you get these policymakers that come in that don't actually work in the private sector and they don't understand the nuance, they come in with a sweeping, we're banning X, right? Unless they understand a business owner of anything is going to find the loophole where I can continue to make money and not lose my investment. And I have a client base that also wants to help me do that. And so I think there's a lot of that type of private negotiation that was going on. And I think to some extent, until you go a full tax year without some of those things, it's hard to vet some of that out until you start looking at, okay, where did all this money come from? If you weren't an active listing, where did this money come from?
It does seem like very city by city specific because, like, yes, I was talking about British Columbia in general, But you look at some cities like Victoria, like where the regulation has really had an impact at the local level. We've seen an essentially a 50% decline in listings of demand, revenues down 55%. Like, and we've essentially cut that market in half. So, yeah, it's not to say that it hasn't had a major impact everywhere, but places where the regulation is being enforced, you clearly see the impact versus other spots where it's not.
Yeah. And I think some of that had a lot to do with who were the people that were renting? Like, who were the people that were the property managers? What was their personal take on it? Because there were a lot of people that just said, "I'm out and I'm going to flip to long term, or I'm going to do something else. I'm going to, divest of this asset." It has a lot to do with how safe a politician felt to enforce that and not lose their seat. And so you get a cultural sort of understanding of what's going on based on how much individuals respect and fall in line with government regulations. I think it's fair to draw that correlation here to what happened after the hurricanes. You had wild deviations in interpretations of regulations. You had, the mayor of Holmes Beach saying that short-term rentals were banned effective like immediately. And DeSantis went on air, like, I think within 30 minutes to like override that ban. So it comes down to at the very local level, who's in charge? Now, Ron DeSantis isn't coming around and handing out room keys either. So how does somebody actually execute an executive order? Like, there has to be people on the ground that say, like, yes, I'm going to enforce this. And I think that has a lot to do with it too, region by region, across every province. And you've got provinces that, and I think Alberta is a prime example of this. Like, Danielle Smith was not leaving negotiations with the United States to Justin Trudeau. And she made it a point. She did not rely on anybody, not even her, the opposition leaders or anything like that. She came herself as Alberta to negotiate with Trump. And so when you've got individual pockets across the country that say, we don't identify with this massive regulation and we are going to do it this way, then it's very difficult to actually enforce it if you have a lot of people that say we're not doing that. And I think, again, you saw that during COVID, right? There were, if you look at some of the media that went on where there were bans beyond short-term rentals, but of even families getting together, there were people that flew in the face of that were willing to be arrested. In Canada, they've resorted to freezing people's bank accounts to get them to adhere because people were not, and that was not COVID. That was, it was the truckers. But like, when you get to the level of like, we're not going to follow this rule and we're going to go through the pain of you froze all my assets and including my checking account, it's difficult to enforce when there's that sort of tension.
So I'm where I'm worried about the US and travel from Canada, I'm less worried and maybe even more bullish on Americans continuing to travel to Canada, given and maybe not the same perception of like we're in this trade war or potential trade war with Canada of like it's cheaper. And you've got 78% of inbound travelers to Canada are from the US. So essentially, the international visitation is like what happens from Americans is like what drives international travel in Canada. And then, and with the dollar strengthening, it makes Canada, which is already, can be a cheaper destination than staying domestic within the US. So if Americans, for better or worse, are treating Canada as the 51st state of like, let's just travel to Canada, like, do you see that that could have sort of knock on benefits to Canadian short term rental hosts, even while they've got some and a lot of other things that could be negatives?
I think so. I mean, if I want to take my kids skiing and I'm looking at the places that I can go in the US that are booked far in advance, are very expensive. There are some amazing operators here in the US that have ski destinations that are outside of my reach. But all of a sudden, with a strengthened dollar, maybe that's, that's on the table of we want to do that. We want to go to, Mont Tremblant. We want to go to Banff and Lake Louise. We want to do those things. And some of those places are bucket list destinations that you want to do that.
So one thing, like, because I knew we were going to talk about this, and I'm like kicking myself. I just booked a trip to Steamboat with my family,
Yeah,
and like it was expensive.
sure.
The average Canadian ski resort on a nightly basis is 34% cheaper than the average US ski resort for nightly rates. So putting them both in US dollars, average Canadian resort is $400 a night. Average US resort is over $600 a night,
Yeah. So
which like blows my mind.
yeah, and then you add on top of that, which I think is going to be really interesting from an economic standpoint, is this GST, the rebates that you can get, similar to Europe, where you can file for VAT reimbursement and that sort of thing. So there's because the GST enforcement and regulation in Canada is wildly complicated, right? Like the first $30,000 you don't pay GST on and all this kind of stuff. Like to me, it amazes me. I would far rather deal with the IRS than CRA any day of the week. But anyway, so what happens then if you do have this influx of because even for Canadians, it's expensive now, right? So what has happened with their own investment portfolios, their own, dollars, the job security, all the rest of it that they're dealing with within their own country, to turn around and say, like, can we afford to go to a ski destination this year? Or are we going to do a staycation around town, right? Like those conversations are likely happening as well. And so if now all of a sudden Americans are coming in because it's cheaper, and for whatever reason, we now believe like going to Steamboat and going to, Lake Louise are basically the same, then like what happens from a GST perspective, right? Like some of the tax bases gets really thrown off that I think amplifies some of the governmental argument of like, hey, we we have a problem. They have a, the reason Trudeau stepped down was right after, this massive budget was tabled and they had a $68 billion deficit. Like it was huge. And it was that there's a real economic problem there. And I don't know that gets better if you have an influx of international travel where they have a different tax model. So I think the fallout of this is not just will there be regulations on short-term rentals? I think you're going to see tax regulations that come across. At the end of the day, money's got to come from somewhere. And how do you get that? And I think some of the promises, some of the commitments that have been made to stave off these tariffs for the next 30 days, I don't know what that does to some of the housing. Airbnb has put up a number of refugees that have come into Canada that are now being questioned by the United States government as a basis for why there's tariffs. Like that complicates things 80,000 times over, right? Like what do you do with those scenarios? So I think it's going to be complicated for a long time. I don't think there's going to be an easy, solution to it. My fear is that there is a sweeping regulation similar to what you saw in Quebec that would come more so from, a federal perspective on something like GST that they can enforce. Like they can't say to Alberta, you're not allowed to have short-term rentals. What they can change is taxation. And I think the elephant in the room too on both sides, which we haven't been there, is does either country go to a visa position? Does either country say, we want to know who these travelers are that are coming in and coming out? And a visa fee is another form of taxation. And then that complicates everything. So I think that's one of the reasons why people enjoy, you know, coming back and forth is you don't have a lot of that red tape. It's simple. You get, students that choose to go to one university versus the other because of proximity. There's a whole program that in Ottawa where my sister went to State University of Potsdam to get her master's in teaching because she couldn't get it in Ontario because it was a very tight lottery system. So you have these economic shifts that they've never been this fragile in a long time, that I think short-term rentals are going to see some backlash on. And you have two countries that are becoming very galvanized in their pride of this. And I think, I've never lived through an experience where you're booing the other team's anthem. And, Americans have a reputation. Does that make everybody like in force go up to, Ottawa for a Senators game? Does what happens with some of that back and forth to sort of up that ante? I think the other thing we were going to talk about was the difference between, on that sentiment of, you know, country pride, is what happens around elections, right? Because the RNC, the DNC conventions here were huge. People traveled from all over to go to those. And so now you've got this liberal leadership race, and it's very different there in terms of, do people go to those types of things? Are they as invested politically as I think Americans are? And I don't know that you're going to see a big rally behind, let's elect the next leader. And then even from there, on the actual election cycle, there were a lot of people that wanted to be in DC on election night. They wanted to be there, whether they thought their candidate was winning and they were right or they were wrong. There was a lot of people that wanted to be there. And I don't, it's just different in Canada because historically your leader goes to their home riding. And so like when Andrew ran, he was in Regina for election night. He wasn't in Ottawa. He wasn't, at the Capitol. And so depending who that liberal leader is, I mean, obviously Jack Mead is going to stay on at this point anyways, as of today, Jack Mead is going to stay on for the NDP. And so he'll be out in British Columbia. And Pierre Poilievre is from the Ottawa area. So he'll be in Ottawa. If the leader ends up being Mark Carney, where is he? And where do people rally to support? People tend not to travel. So I think some of the things we count on as Americans for those influxes, I think you're going to see a big dip here with travel teams not traveling as much. If there's bans and there's just not capacity in Canada, what happens to those travel teams? Can you make up that difference? I think it's Minot, North Dakota gets a lot of the travel that comes in from Saskatchewan and Alberta for basketball and volleyball and that sort of thing. Like some of those areas, I don't know.
Yeah. And seems like there's still a whole lot of unknowns out there on what's going to come to be. And maybe wrapping up, since we've got now 45 minutes talking about it. What's your predictions for the rest of 2025?
For the short-term rentals in Canada, I think it's bumpy.
Or whatever you're willing to make a prediction on.
I think there will be nothing but change. Lots and lots of change. Yeah, I think it's gonna be very interesting. And I think at the end of the day, there's a lot of family protectionism that's kind of going on, saying where does my dollar go? And who am I willing to entrust my dollar to for my family's memory? And I think that's what every operator should be mindful of.
Okay, Catherine, and this was a lot of fun. Anything else you want to mention before we sign off?
Get out and vote wherever you are. Make sure your voice is heard.
Awesome.
Thank you.
We'll definitely be watching and keep an eye on what's gonna come forward, because as we've seen in the past few weeks, like it's been wild.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining.
Thank you.
Yeah.